Is there a future for big agencies in China? Now this is thoughtful. Hello, I'm Trevor Lai in Shanghai. Going back to the Mad Men era, the ad industry has been driven by big agencies with a national and later international presence. Most of those agencies have been swallowed up by a small group of holding companies that critics say are driven by number-crunching suits. At the same time, media has become increasingly fragmented, and social media has put consumers more in control of brand image than ever before, especially in China. So the factors that created global agency networks are starting to change. Is there a future for big agencies in this market? Let's find out. We're joined in the studio today by David Wolf, Managing Director of the Global China Practice at Allison & Partners, a longtime China expert who has consulted American, Chinese, and European companies. Hi, David. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you, mate. How are you?
I'm doing well. So let's talk about the complex communications challenges that you deal with on a day-to-day basis for foreign firms in China or Chinese firms overseas. You've identified some issues that you think exist within the current 4A model within China, but also overseas. Talk about the main issues.
Okay. Well, I mean, like you, I'm a veteran of kind of the big 4As. I've worked my time for Martin Sorrell. I've had my stock options, and we've sort of been through that time. And it was an interesting experience because it gives you an opportunity to see where the advantages are and where the disadvantages are with the model. I mean, the 4As model, the way it's practiced today is the really large agencies are now conglomerated into these massive organizations, Publicis, WPP, Omnicom. There was a reason for their emergence, and the reason was the lunatics had taken over the asylum in this industry in the United States. I mean, we love watching Mad Men today, don't we? And one of the reasons we do it is because we look back sort of, wistfully saying, those were the good old days. Yeah, those were great days to work for the agency, but they weren't necessarily great days if you were, keeping the books on an agency. There were lots of ways to bring some efficiencies, some sanities into the model. But you have to recognize that that's precisely where these groups come from. They emerged so that they could bring order to chaos in advertising agencies and PR and communications agencies in developed markets. In markets where growth wasn't huge, where we had allowed our awards to sort of become the most important thing, and client satisfaction, that was important, but we'd really sort of fallen into our own navels. And so there was some discipline necessary. Here's the problem with the model. The model doesn't work very well if one of two things is happening. Either A, you're experiencing very high growth, and you have to build an organization that's designed for growth, or B, there's a great deal of change taking in the industry that requires you to make changes to the company. Unfortunately, here in China, we're operating in a perfect storm. Both of those things are happening at the same time. So growth is high and change is rapid. Within the structure of the large 4As, though, it's very difficult when you've got people like Sir Martin Sorrell looking over your shoulder to say, hey, excuse me, Sir Martin, can we just have a timeout? We're going to take this agency apart, and we're going to put it back together so it's a 21st century agency that can deal with 21st century media.
And built for China, for example.
And built for China. And that's what we're going to do, but we need a timeout, and we need about a year with either no profits or negative profits and zero growth. And the answer is going to come back loud and clear from London, no, you're not. Okay, it's just not allowed to happen. The other challenge is, of course, if you're growing here in China, the disciplines placed on these agencies is you can't even hire somebody. You can't even hire basically an executive assistant without getting approval either from New York or London. In a market like this where the industry is growing so quickly and the demand for people is so high, you simply can't staff an agency like that. I had lunch recently with the China CEO of a 4A's agency, and he literally cried in his beer. He said, I have now lost 4 consecutive hires because we could not move quickly enough to hire them. And they just said, fine, I'm going to go someplace else. Or I'm going to go start my own gig.
And are they going, when they say someplace else, is that another 4A or is it a local agency?
It's interesting. It used to be they would just jump into another 4A, okay? There used to be, and I'll talk about this in a minute, they aren't jumping there just to 4As anymore because a lot of them have said, yeah, a 4A agency, been there, done that, want something different. Maybe want an opportunity to participate in profits, want to feel that this is more my company, want a chance to change things rather than have it dictated to me from the U.S. or someplace else.
By a foreigner who maybe doesn't spend a lot of time in
By a
China.
foreigner who may be completely clueless about China, right? And when you work in these agencies, you also recognize a lot of opportunities to create some efficiencies. For one thing, you aren't kicking a huge chunk of your profits back upstairs in order to support the people who, operate at the regional level, who operate at the global level, who operate at the global group level. You're not supporting all that overhead. You're not supporting all that tail, and so you find efficiencies very quickly. When I first went off on my own, I found that I could make a higher profit at half the price, for example, on a media training, than my agency BM could make if it charged much more than that. I was making more money per training than Burson Marsteller was, and I was charging on average between 40 and 50% of what they were charging, just because there were so many efficiencies that were then built into the process. And I think a lot of these younger Chinese people see that too. And so that's a lot of what's changing.
Well, let's talk specifically about some of the local agencies that either exist or come into existence when these hires decide to go off on their own. What do you think is their role in the Chinese market from a creative standpoint, but also in terms of being true competition for these forays? I mean, are they snapping up really small clients that would never be clients that forays would consider, or are they starting to compete for bigger pieces of business?
Well, initially they were relying on two things. They were relying first on the fact that there were clients that either A, the forays wouldn't consider, or B, that particularly local clients they were picking up local clients who weren't comfortable themselves dealing with forays because they felt that they were too small, or they felt that what the forays had to offer wasn't China relevant. So that's how they initially grew. We're now starting to see some of the better ones, some of the more creative, more business-like ones compete head-to-head with the forays for some clients. And we're seeing that pretty much across the board, not just in advertising, but we're seeing it in public relations as well. We're seeing it in digital. We're seeing it in social media, where a lot of these hot little shops have started up, and they're doing really well. The one place where we aren't seeing it, and I don't think we're going to see it for a very long time, we're not seeing it as much in media buying. I really think that when you look at the kind of market share that Mindshare, that Group M and organizations like that have, it's been a highly fragmented industry. They are defragmenting it. They are taking up more and more because you do have efficiencies of scale.
And also the market there itself, what they're dealing with all the different types of media itself is in turmoil. So I think consolidation there makes sense.
It does. And the other thing that happens is, you look at, I use Group M as an example. I have a huge amount of respect for what's happening over there, what Bessie Lee has left behind her before she went up to the group level. They have the wherewithal to fund within the group a highly experimental organization to say, all right, what are we going to do with the new media? How is it that we can create the practices? And then when they find something that works, then they percolate that as part of their modus operandi back into the broader organization. So they've built a mechanism for innovation and for adaptation into the organization. They're the exception, though, that proves the rule. And they even can't be as fast as they need to be sometimes because they're constrained within that group section of how much they can spend, how innovative they can be, how many people they can hire in the process. So they also remain constrained. So they're actually fighting with some of these smaller agencies. It is an effort to keep up more than an effort to lead, and they're doing a fairly good job, but I don't know if they're moving fast enough to beat some of these smaller companies.
Let's switch perspectives and talk about how clients perceive forays now within China, both foreign brands and companies as well as local ones. 10 years ago, there was a lot of luster and a lot of shine around foray agency and what they could bring to the table. How does that compare to now?
Well, I mean, there were a lot of reasons that there was luster and shine 10 years ago. The first thing is, a lot of the people who were making decisions here about media buys, about ad spend and all that, a lot of them were expatriates. And so these were people who understood the way the forays worked, were comfortable with it, and looked at the forays and they said, okay, you guys have got scale, I got to be everywhere in China, you guys have got a lot of people, I don't have a huge staff.
Well, they were also the people in the Rolodex to begin with.
Right, I mean, exactly. And the other thing that the forays had was that there was a real gap 10 years ago between the sort of forays here and then everybody else down here. And in many respects, we would joke about it, that there was such a gap that, I mean, basically these people down here were bottom feeders. They were just kind of scooping up. In many respects, they would take a commission and then they would farm it out sometimes even to the forays because there was just no skill. There was no creativity, there was no science, no nothing. What happened over that 10 years is we started shedding some of that first generation of real professionals that came out of the industry that would leave and they say, okay, I'm leaving, I've got 10 years experience, I'm starting my own gig. And maybe I'm doing something that I'm really interested in, or maybe I'm doing the same thing that these other guys are doing, I'm just being more nimble. And so all of a sudden, that quality gap began to shrink. And so to a great degree, the 4As have lost their luster, not so much by their own fault, but just because that's how the market's developed. And so we're not quite at the point that we are in the United States. In the United States, on the one hand, you could talk about a JWT, on the other hand, you could talk about a Crispin Porter, okay? And you could equate them. Now, Crispin Porter, much smaller, part of MDC, very, very small organization. JWT, humongous, part of WPP, but you could talk about them in the same breath from a creative standpoint and from a skill standpoint, because these guys are really hot and they're really good. Arguably, and I'm biased here because they're a sister company in the MDC group, I would say that the Crispin Porter guys are probably better, okay? But we're still not quite at that point in China, but we're getting there, and I would say we're at the most maybe 5 years away from it.
But when you're talking about creative talent, also 5 to 10 years ago, there was a perception that in order to be superior in terms of creativity or perhaps strategic planning, et cetera, you needed expat or foreign leadership, or at least someone in a real key role here guiding the agency. Do you see now, with whether it's shrinking budgets or increased competition, that more and more of those roles are shifting to local Chinese or overseas educated Chinese who come back and work at these 4As?
I don't necessarily think it's budgets. I mean, having been far too much on the corporate side of having to hire, one of the things that you'll find is, no matter where you go in the world, and now that includes China, somebody who's creative, somebody who's talented, is going to be expensive. All right, we're not at the point anymore where at that level of the agency, we're seeing the kinds of gaps that existed before. And I've talked to a couple agencies that said the gaps have basically shrunk to maximum 5%, or in some cases they simply don't exist. Because the Chinese have really moved up the value chain. A very small but growing group of Chinese are at the point where arguably they're every bit as good as the foreigners. I mean, a few years ago we started seeing Chinese agencies winning overseas commissions and winning awards for them. This is Chinese talent. So we certainly have the creativity here. We simply need to build that stratum. As to whether or not we still need foreigners, I think it's a matter of a couple of things. What are you trying to accomplish? You know, what we're looking for in this business is we're looking for people who have a certain scope of talents, who have integrity, who are good people to work with, who understand how to build teams and have a good feeling for quality. More and more of those people are Chinese, but there's still a lot more foreigners hanging around who happen to have those skill sets. We're gradually able to substitute them out because the locals aren't necessarily cheaper, but they're certainly very culturally attuned, or there's a perception that they're culturally attuned. I'll tell you where I think we're going long term. Long term, it's not going to matter what the color of your skin is. We're going to have a group of expats who are very China familiar. We're going to have a group of Chinese who are very China familiar. And in America, we're going to have a group of Chinese executives who may have come up the pipe here in China, but are now taking global, if not international roles. Bessie Lee is an excellent example. Here's someone now who's reached the pinnacle of the organization here in China. She actually has a global role with WPP. We're going to see more of that in the next 5 to 10 years, not less. So in essence, it's going to matter less and less what the color of your skin is. It's going to matter less and less what it says in your passport, and more, what is it that you bring to the table?
Well, it's very easy also to stand back and say the system's broken, the ship's going down. But what's one critical step, action step, that these 4As should be taking right now in terms of starting to steer the ship correctly? Or do you think they should just abandon ship?
Oh, well, I mean, you know, keeping my corporate hat on, I'd say they should abandon ship and give it up altogether. That's obviously not going to happen. And I'm joking, seriously, I don't think so. I think there's always going to be a role for the 4As agencies. I think what's changing is that role is shrinking, that so much is changing in this business that they need to step back and make room for these little guys. There's 3 ways that they can adapt, essentially. The first way is acquisition. And the 4As have made some very smart acquisitions here in China. The most recent one that I think the most about is a subsidiary of WPP that came in and purchased Sam Fleming Shop CIC. Highly specialized organization, great technology, needed the help of a big organization in order to scale it.
Yeah.
Right, and so it was a very good match. That was a very smart buy, and so acquisition's good. But when you're talking about acquisition outside of that scope, where you're buying something unique and special, when you're buying headcount, when you're buying talent, when you're buying people who have good client relationships, that's only a temporary solution. You buy those people, you lock them up for 7 years, and 7 years later they're walking out the door with a box of trophies under their arm and saying, "Thanks, Sir Martin, we're out of here." So that's only a temporary solution. The other solution is to adapt. Take this pyramidal structure that they've got that removes your senior people from the clients, squash the pyramidal structure, make them smaller, make them much more responsive, start operating a big agency as a group of really small agencies, go away from the pyramid model and start acting like associates and partners like as in a law firm. The problem is how are you going to change the engine of a car where you're going 60 miles an hour? And in order to adapt like that, you need to fundamentally change the conditions under which these companies are allowed to operate. That would take a tough call from London.
Headquarters.
Yeah, and they don't want to see the cash cow, removing its udder, okay, if you will. They want to see this thing consistently played. They want to squeeze it, they want to play it out, and okay, if this winds up shrinking, we'll go buy something else. And this is the other problem in the industry. We've got millions of dollars for acquisition in the 4As, and we have nothing for hiring, and we have nothing for hiring ahead of the curve, and we have nothing for raises. So you're not keeping the people either. So you've got the acquisition, you've got adaptation, which is not likely, and the acquisition is a very short-term thing. And the other part of it is to recognize that in the long term, the market's going to go away, and that you need to fight to see who's going to be the most efficient. I think we have a lot of 4As in this country today. I think we're going to see fewer over time. Look what's happened to Y&R. Y&R, for all intents and purposes, doesn't really exist here anymore. I think we're going to see more of the marginal 4A advertising agencies get squeezed out. I also think what we're going to see is we're going to see a Chinese 4A emerge. I saw a plan, I won't say where I saw it a few weeks ago, to create the functional equivalent of a Chinese Dentsu. And the plan is circulating, the funds are being raised, it's going to happen. So I think it's a silly model, but it also means that there's going to be competition for the 4As from a clone of their own kind. But I do think it's going to get tougher for them, and I think that the real way forward for these guys is to start thinking, how can we be more nimble, how can we be smaller, how can we actually recognize that over the long term, our big agencies are too big to succeed.
David, some thought-provoking ideas and thoughts. Thanks for being on Thoughtful China.
It's been a delight. Thanks very much.
That wraps it up for today. Be sure to subscribe to us on Tudo and YouTube. You can also follow us on Weibo and Twitter and join our LinkedIn group. See you again.